Funny how peace and quiet can turn into war in the blink of an eye. One day you're sipping coffee on your porch, watching the sun stretch across your fields. And the next, you're knee-deep in drama you never asked for. I didn't go looking for a fight. Hell, I'd spent most of my life avoiding them. But when someone turns your own land into their personal parking lot and dares to tell you it's their right, well, that's when the gloves come off. This isn't just a story about property lines or petty power trips. It's about what happens when you stand up, finally, for what's yours. And trust me, the fallout, it's one hell of a ride. Ben Whitaker wasn't the kind of man to raise his voice. Years in the Army had taught him that real power came from calm decisions and quiet resolve. So when he stepped out of his farmhouse that Friday morning and saw the glossy white SUV parked smack in the middle of his woodworking barn for the fifth time, he didn't scream, he didn't curse, he didn't even drop his coffee, but his jaw did clench, hard. There it was again. Cheryl Brighton's oversized, pearl-white vehicle, sitting bold and proud, practically shining under the morning sun like it belonged there. The vanity plate read, Karen, a joke turned prophecy in their small town of Harmony Ridge. The woman had practically made entitlement into an art form. Ben set his mug down on the nearest fence post, took a long breath, and stepped forward. The barn door hung half open, just enough to reveal what he already feared. The SUV was parked just inside the entrance, taking up half the main workspace. A lazy scrawl of a note had been taped to the side of the sliding door. Jake, I'll pick it up Monday. Don't touch my car. It's new and I don't want dust on it. Ben blinked. Once, twice. Monday. It was Friday morning. For a full 60 seconds he stood there, letting the wind whistle through the fields and the distant sound of his cattle echo like a distant choir of disapproval. He could feel the pressure in his chest building, tight, restrained fury that didn't explode, but solidified into something sharper, cooler. The first time Cheryl had done this, she'd said it was just for an hour while I run into town. The second time, it was because her driveway was being pressure washed. The third time, she told him his barn had better shade and she didn't want her leather seats getting too hot. And each time, Ben had let it slide, thinking maybe, just maybe, it was a one-off. But Cheryl wasn't a one-off kind of problem. She was a habit, a pattern, a symptom of what was broken in Harmony Ridge, a neighborhood governed by a homeowners association more concerned with power than people. Ben had tried the polite route, conversations, reminders, even an email to the HOA board, which Cheryl just so happened to lead, and nothing changed. Until now. He stared at the note one more time, then reached for the heavy steel padlock he kept hanging beside the door. With a slow, deliberate motion, he closed the barn doors, slid the lock into place, and turned the key with a satisfying click. Then he smiled. That weekend, Ben had plans. Ones Cheryl wouldn't interrupt. A trip to his family's old hunting cabin 2 hours away, nestled deep in the woods. No cell signal, no drama, just peace. Before he left, he double-checked the security camera feed aimed at the barn. A clear, time-stamped view of the SUV parked inside. No tampering, no tricks. Just good evidence. Because if there was one thing Ben knew, it was to never go into battle unarmed. By the time he reached the county line, Cheryl had already called him 5 times. He didn't answer. By the time he arrived at the cabin and cracked open a cold beer on the porch, she had texted 21 times and left him 7 voicemails, each one angrier than the last. The final one ended with, "You better be back by Monday morning or I will call the sheriff, Ben. You're not going to get away with this." He took a slow sip and watched the lake shimmer in the late afternoon sun. For the first time in months, he felt good. No HOA politics, no noise, no Cheryl, just stillness. Back in Harmony Ridge, however, things were starting to unravel, and Ben didn't even need to witness it to know it. By Monday morning, the sleepy town of Harmony Ridge was anything but peaceful. Ben pulled into his gravel driveway, fresh off a quiet weekend in the woods, feeling like a new man. That peace evaporated the moment he saw the flashing red and blue lights. A county deputy was parked at the end of his drive, sipping coffee with a bemused look on his face. And standing next to the barn, pacing like a lioness in a cage, was Cheryl Brighton. Designer sunglasses, 6-inch heels, and fury radiating off her like heat from the summer asphalt. Ben didn't flinch. He calmly parked his truck, stepped out, and gave a slow nod toward the deputy. "Morning, Officer Reynolds." Reynolds tipped his coffee in greeting. "Morning, Ben. Seems we've got ourselves a bit of a neighborly situation." Before Ben could answer, Cheryl pounced. You locked my car in your barn. That is unlawful imprisonment of private property, and I will press charges." Ben raised an eyebrow. "You mean the car you parked in my barn? Without permission?" Cheryl's mouth opened to retort, but froze as Reynolds held up a hand. "Ma'am, I reviewed the security footage Mr. Whitaker provided. It clearly shows you entering his barn, parking your vehicle, and taping a note to the door. You left it there voluntarily." Cheryl's voice sharpened. "That doesn't mean he can just lock it in. That's malicious. He didn't even call me." Ben calmly pulled out the note, now laminated, just for flair. "You wrote, and I quote, 'Don't touch my car.' So I didn't. I locked the barn for safety." Reynolds snorted behind his coffee, trying not to laugh. Cheryl, red-faced and trembling, stormed to the barn door and began rattling the padlock like she was trying to rip it off with sheer indignation. "This is harassment. You think this is over, Ben? You're going to regret this. I've already spoken to the HOA." Ben took a step forward. "Funny thing about that. You are the HOA." "That's right," she snapped. "Then you've got no one left to complain to but yourself." The deputy shook his head. "Look, this is civil, not criminal. You'll need to settle this yourselves or in small claims." Ben reached into his pocket, pulled out the key, and strolled to the barn. "Since it's Monday and you asked so nicely." He unlocked the barn doors and swung them wide. And then it happened. Cheryl screamed. 3 raccoons, clearly displeased with the disturbance, scurried from her vehicle in a blur of fur, leaving behind a trail of shredded napkins, footprints, and what could only be described as raccoon opinions of her leather seats. One even hissed at her as it darted past. Cheryl jumped back as though she'd been electrocuted, eyes wide, clutching her designer purse like a shield. "What is that?" Ben folded his arms. "Looks like they found a nice weekend retreat. You know, great shades in there." The deputy laughed out loud this time. "That's what happens when you leave the windows cracked on a farm." Cheryl turned on Ben, finger jabbing toward him like a weapon. "This is your fault. You planted them." Ben blinked slowly. "You think I trained raccoons to break into your SUV and redecorate? You set me up." "No," he said flatly. "You set yourself up. And now I think we're even." She stormed toward her car, hesitated at the door, then recoiled. "It smells like a zoo." "Smells like boundaries," Ben quipped. "You might want to get it detailed." Reynolds tipped his hat, trying to hide a grin. "I think we're done here." But Cheryl wasn't finished, not even close. As she peeled away in her sullied SUV, Ben knew it wouldn't end here. Cheryl wasn't the type to accept defeat, not when there was a bigger game to play. And sure enough, the real war was just beginning. Because people like Cheryl, they don't retreat, they regroup. 2 days passed. Ben thought maybe, just maybe, the raccoon incident had humbled Cheryl into retreating quietly. But he should have known better. People like her didn't lick their wounds. They filed lawsuits. It came in a thick, cream-colored envelope delivered by a man who looked almost apologetic. Ben tore it open while standing on his porch. Inside was a typed letter filled with legal jargon, dramatic phrasing, and one unmistakably absurd accusation. Intentional endangerment of property, harassment, emotional trauma, and negligent containment of wild animals. She was suing him for $25,000. Ben snorted. That's adorable. But the paperwork was real. A court date was set, and Cheryl had signed it all with her usual oversized signature in curling, angry ink. He called his cousin Ellie, an attorney in nearby Greenville. She laughed for a full minute before managing. Ben, I swear, only you would get sued over raccoons. Yeah, well, I need this shut down before she turns it into a circus. Ellie agreed to represent him, and they began compiling everything: the barn footage, the note Cheryl had left, the timestamps, the calls she made, and the recording of her claiming he'd pay for this. Meanwhile, Cheryl was busy making sure everyone in Harmony Ridge knew her version of the story. She spun a tale of rural savagery and male chauvinism, of being targeted for being a woman in leadership. At the next HOA bulletin, printed and hand-delivered as always, she wrote a dramatic open letter about the dangers of unchecked aggression and how one woman stood her ground against intimidation. She held a backyard support brunch under white tents for her carefully curated allies. But what she didn't realize was how thin the ice beneath her stilettos had become. See, Ben wasn't just some cranky farmer. He was the neighbor who helped fix your tractor without charging a dime. He was the guy who shoveled Miss Lillian's walkway after every snowstorm. The man who rebuilt Old Man Carpenter's fence for free after the wind took it down last year. So when Cheryl went after Ben, she wasn't just launching a legal attack. She was firing a shot at the heart of the neighborhood, and people noticed. The first to visit was Mr. Ross, the retired Army vet from across the street. He handed Ben a small brown envelope with faded writing. It's a copy of the old HOA agreement from when this place was just 30 houses, Ross said, before Cheryl turned it into a country club. Ben opened it, and there it was. A clause that required any personal disputes involving HOA leadership to go through mediation before lawsuits were allowed. That meant Cheryl had violated the very rules she was hiding behind. Then came Carol Daniels, a soft-spoken widow who'd never raised her voice in 20 years. She brought Ben a tray of cookies and a memory. She fined me $300 for unapproved garden gnomes, Carol whispered. I didn't even own any. They were from my granddaughter's birthday party. Ben blinked. She fined you for decorations? Carol nodded. They said it disrupted the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony, and then it spread. More neighbors came forward, each one carrying a story. Send a young couple who had been fined for building a small sandbox. A disabled veteran who had received violation letters for his ramp not matching the house trim. A single mom whose daughter had been forbidden from using chalk on the driveway. Each story added weight to Ben's cause and pulled the mask off Cheryl's carefully crafted image. The neighborhood had started as a place of quiet kindness, but under Cheryl's reign, it had become a place of fear and passive resentment. All it took was someone standing up, someone with enough stubbornness and decency to shake that loose. Ben was never one for politics, but as he sat at his kitchen table, watching Ellie highlight each testimony, he realized this was bigger than a car, bigger than a raccoon invasion. This was about reclaiming something that had been taken from all of them. He wasn't going into court alone anymore. He was taking a village with him. The courthouse in Brook Hollow wasn't large, 2 stories of red brick with an American flag flapping lazily in the spring breeze. But to Ben, it felt like the Colosseum. Except this time, the lion wasn't him. It was Cheryl, and she had no idea. Ben arrived with Ellie and a box of organized documents, video clips, signed testimonials, and printouts of every petty fine, manipulated bylaw, and fabricated HOA violation Cheryl had used to bully the neighborhood for years. Cheryl was already inside, flanked by her attorney. Some slick-looking man in an expensive suit who looked like he had never set foot on a farm in his life. She wore a power blue skirt suit, a stiff smile, and an air of smug entitlement so thick you could bottle it. When she saw Ben walk in, her eyes narrowed. Then they landed on Ellie. Her expression faltered for half a second. Court began promptly at 10:02 a.m. The judge, a middle-aged woman with silver hair and a no-nonsense tone, opened with the kind of measured calm that warned everyone not to try anything dramatic. Cheryl's lawyer was the first to speak. His voice was smooth, but his arguments were fluff. He painted Ben as vindictive and hostile, claiming he intentionally endangered Cheryl's property by failing to notify her of unsafe wildlife and unlawfully obstructing vehicular access. Then came Cheryl's testimony. She put on a show, sighs, trembling hands, and a description of the raccoons that made them sound like armed robbers instead of startled woodland critters. "I was traumatized, Your Honor," she sniffled. "It's not just about the car. It's about the principle. I was targeted." Ben almost laughed. When Ellie stood, her calm was surgical. "Your Honor, if it pleases the court, we would like to submit Exhibit A." She handed over the video from Ben's security camera. The courtroom watched as Cheryl's SUV calmly drove onto Ben's property, parked inside his open barn, and then Cheryl taped a note to the door. "Jake, I'll pick it up Monday. Don't touch my car." The judge blinked slowly. "This is your handwriting, Miss Hartwell?" Cheryl squirmed. "Yes. But I didn't expect—" "Please answer yes or no." "Yes." "Thank you." Ellie turned to the courtroom, now packed with neighbors, some of whom had taken off work just to witness the showdown. She played the second video, raccoons crawling through the cracked driver's window, attracted by an open snack bag. No foul play, no forced entry, just poor decision-making. Then Ellie did something unexpected. "Your Honor, we'd like to submit community affidavits from over 20 HOA members, all of whom have documented consistent patterns of targeted fines, abuse of power, and selective enforcement by Miss Hartwell in her role as HOA president." She handed over a thick stack. The courtroom rustled with quiet murmurs. Cheryl turned pale. Then Ellie pulled out the HOA's original charter, the one Ross had handed Ben. She flipped to the page and read aloud. "All disputes involving elected HOA officers must undergo mandatory mediation prior to civil litigation, per Article 8, Section 3B. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Miss Hartwell, did you attempt mediation before filing the suit?" Cheryl looked to her attorney. He avoided eye contact. "No, Your Honor, but this was an emergency." There are specific steps for emergencies. None were followed. In fact, the suit itself is procedurally invalid. The courtroom went silent. Ben looked down at his hands, trying not to show too much satisfaction. But then the judge dropped the real hammer. "Miss Hartwell, based on the evidence and the pattern of behavior outlined here, I am dismissing your suit with prejudice. Furthermore, I am ordering a formal review of your actions as HOA president. This may include a suspension pending the outcome." Cheryl looked like she'd been slapped. Her mouth opened, then closed. The power blue suit suddenly seemed to swallow her whole. Ben glanced around the courtroom. Neighbors were smiling, whispering. For the first time in years, someone had stood up to Cheryl, and won. But he wasn't done. As everyone began to file out, Ben approached the bench. "Your Honor, if I may, I'm requesting that the HOA consider a public vote of no confidence regarding Miss Hartwell's position as president." The judge gave a curt nod. "Noted. That is within the community's right to initiate. Proceed accordingly." Cheryl shot up. "You can't do that. I was elected." Ben turned to face her, not with anger, but clarity. "And now, we're electing to move on." The court ruling hit Cheryl like a hammer. The once unshakable president of the Oak Ridge HOA returned to the neighborhood with her tail tucked, publicly embarrassed, legally defeated, and quietly furious. But it didn't stop there. By Wednesday, a petition had begun circulating. Ben hadn't started it. Ross had. Within 24 hours, 37 homeowners signed. By Friday, that number had doubled. What had once been whispered complaints became bold conversations over fences and shared in group texts titled, Take back Oak Ridge. People were finally talking about how Cheryl fined a single mom $250 for a garden gnome, about how she told the Andersons their mailbox lowered property values and forced them to replace it, about how she once had a teenager ticketed for parking 1 inch over the community line. The control Cheryl had held for so long, through fear, shame, and bureaucracy, was unraveling. And Ben? Ben became the reluctant spark of something far greater than he had expected. It started small. Mrs. Gutierrez, who barely spoke English, showed up at Ben's door with a Tupperware of tamales and a grateful smile. "Thank you," she said quietly, pressing the warm container into his hands. Then came Tim and Valerie, the young couple from 2 streets over. "We've been too scared to speak up," Tim admitted. "But seeing what you did, we're done being quiet." Ben, who never wanted attention, found himself at the center of a quiet revolution. The next HOA meeting was unlike any other. Instead of empty rows and Cheryl's condescending monologues, the community room was packed. Neighbors stood against the back wall, arms crossed, not with hostility, but with resolve. Cheryl walked in late, trying to hold her usual posture of confidence, but her eyes flicked nervously around the room. She could feel it. The shift. The silence no longer meant compliance. Ross stood up and read the petition. "We, the undersigned residents of Oak Ridge, hereby call for a vote of no confidence in HOA President Cheryl Hartwell, citing patterns of abuse, selective enforcement, and failure to uphold community values." Ben didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Cheryl stood. "You're making a mistake. I've protected this neighborhood for years. Without rules, we'll descend into chaos. You think you want freedom, but you'll regret it." A hand shot up in the crowd. So Dennison, a retired Navy veteran, spoke. "Ma'am, I've fought in real wars. What you call protection feels a lot like dictatorship." The room rippled with soft laughter and knowing nods. The vote happened that night. The tally was swift, decisive, and devastating. 81% voted to remove Cheryl. She left the building in silence. No speech, no exit message, just the sound of her heels fading against the polished tile. In the following days, things began to change. The HOA board, now led by Ross and supported by newly elected members, rolled back dozens of pointless fines and announced a full review of all enforcement policies. They launched an initiative to translate HOA notices into multiple languages. They opened monthly community forums. They even invited residents to propose improvements, not just rules. The neighborhood changed, tangibly, not just in the landscaping or paperwork, but in the energy. People waved more. Kids played louder. Fences became places for conversation, not warnings. And Ben? Ben returned to his quiet life, the barn, finally peaceful, the phone, blissfully silent. The view from his porch, unbothered by white SUVs or angry voicemail threats. But something within him had shifted too. He had stood up, not just for himself, but for fairness. And the town had followed. It had been 2 weeks since the vote. 2 weeks of long overdue peace and subtle celebration in Oak Ridge. Ben had returned to his quiet rituals. Early coffee on the porch, feeding the cows, sunset walks with his dog, Duke. Life had a way of balancing itself out once the noise died down. But he knew it wasn't over, not completely. Cheryl Hartwell hadn't left town. She hadn't shown her face at community events. But her pristine white Lexus was still parked in her driveway. Her porch lights still flicked on at sunset. She was biding her time, or maybe, for the first time in her life, she was grappling with consequences. And then, one quiet Thursday morning, she came to his door. Ben heard the knock as he was fixing the hinge on the barn. He wiped his hands on a rag and opened the front door, surprised to see her standing there, not in her usual polished pantsuit or designer sunglasses, but in jeans, a simple cardigan, and no makeup. Her voice was quiet. May I speak with you for a moment? Ben nodded, stepping aside. She didn't come in, just stood at the threshold looking around his porch like she'd never really seen it before. I know I'm the last person you want to see, she started, voice calm, but tinged with something that sounded almost like humility. I didn't come to argue or threaten. I just, I wanted to say something. Ben said nothing, letting the silence speak. I was wrong, she said, hands twisting together. About a lot of things. About this job. About how I treated people. About you. Ben raised an eyebrow, skeptical, but silent. Cheryl looked away, gathering her thoughts. My husband left 6 years ago. He said I was impossible to live with. He wasn't wrong. After that, I threw everything into the HOA. Control gave me a sense of order. It made me feel like I mattered. I see now it just made me feared. Her voice cracked slightly. I thought what I was doing was good for the community. But the truth is, I was just, hiding in the rules. Ben folded his arms, still listening. Cheryl looked him in the eye for the first time. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted to tell you, thank you, for standing up. You did what no one else had the courage to do. And this neighborhood, it's better now. Because of you. Ben nodded slowly. It wasn't about courage. It was about enough being enough. A sad smile tugged at her lips. Yeah, that's usually what it takes. She turned to leave, then hesitated. I'm selling the house, moving closer to my sister in Oregon. I think it's time for something quieter. He said nothing, and after a long pause, she gave him a soft nod and walked down the steps. No dramatic goodbyes, no final speech. Just a woman who had finally seen the damage her shadow had cast. A week later, the for sale sign went up. Neighbors watched quietly as movers came and went. Cheryl never made another scene, never interrupted another meeting. She simply disappeared into the rearview mirror of the town she once ruled. That Saturday, the new HOA board hosted a picnic in the community park. Potluck style, no mandatory RSVPs, no fines for uncut grass or off-brand coolers. Ben showed up with homemade cornbread and a folding chair. Kids ran through the sprinklers. Someone brought a guitar. The laughter came easy now. At one point, Ross raised a plastic cup. To new beginnings, and to the guy who reminded us we don't have to be quiet to be good neighbors. Everyone turned to Ben. He nodded modestly, raising his cup. To peace, finally earned. That night, back on his porch, he looked out over the fields, the stars just starting to prick the sky. The barn was quiet, the driveway clear, his phone blissfully silent. Ben leaned back in his chair, a warm breeze ruffling his flannel sleeve, and smiled. Sometimes, justice didn't need noise. Sometimes it just needed one person to say, enough. And sometimes that was all it took to set everyone else free.